Greetings! In this video, we will show you the basic steps to UI development in OpenLMIS version 3. We'll add a simple Hello World screen into the OpenLMIS UI. We'll walk through all the steps, checking out a Git repository, building and running locally, making our new screen, and seeing our change. So first, let's start with the prerequisites you need to develop for the OpenLMIS UI. This video is using Ubuntu Linux, but you could also use Windows or Mac to develop for OpenLMIS. We're using this fresh install of Linux. And what else is required? Well, number one, Docker is required. Docker Community Edition with Docker Compose, and there are instructions for most platforms at docker.com. Secondly, Git, which we installed in our command line terminal. Third, a terminal is required. So to develop for OpenLMIS, you'll need to be comfortable using a command line to run builds or start Docker containers. Number four, some editor or IDE is required, and in this video we use an editor called Atom. For developing the OpenLMIS UI, you could choose any editor or your preferred IDE. And finally, we need a web browser. Ubuntu already comes with Firefox, and the OpenLMIS UI supports both Firefox and Chrome, so take your pick. Okay, if you need time to get any of these prerequisites ready on your workstation, then pause the video here. Once you have these prerequisites, we're ready to walk through a Hello World example. So before we start coding, we want to check out a Git repository for the OpenLMIS UI, do a local build, and run the UI locally in a browser. So we'll start by cloning a Git repository. And in this video, we're going to clone the OpenLMIS reference UI repo. Now, the OpenLMIS UI is actually a modular UI app that's built from multiple requisitions. So usually you would add a new screen or UI component into one of the other more specific repositories, and we'll see two of them later in this video. What's important to know is all of these UI repositories use Docker Compose with the same base image. They all use a base image called dev.ui that provides all the same build tools in each of these other UI repos. And the only difference in these other repos is which components are organized into which repository. So for today's Hello World example, we're going to use the reference UI repository, check it out, and add our new screen. So let's drill in and get the URL of this repo to clone. Here we go. Open up our terminal, and we will make a new directory for this project to keep everything we check out in a folder. So we'll go ahead and clone that OpenLMIS reference UI. Okay, that was fast. That's done. And next, now that we've checked out the code, we can start this Docker container. So we're going to run this container, and remember, this repository contains just a few source files along with a Docker Compose file that has the base image definition saying that the base image is that dev.ui that provides all the build tools like Grunt and Phantom.js. We don't have to install any of those tools on our local workstation because we spin up the container with all those tools provided. So we can do a Docker Compose run specifying the service ports flag, and we will run the reference UI container. Oh, and it needs an env file. So this .env file can be empty. It doesn't need to provide any settings, but the file is required. Okay, so the container is running, and actually the first time you ever run it, it will maybe show more download steps than it did for me because it needs to download all the other containers or images it depends on, which it will do, and then spin up. So now the prompt we are at is the running container. This is our command prompt inside the reference UI container, and remember it's based on the dev.ui project. So this is now inside the container where we have our build tools. So at this point, we could get ready to run a build, And the first thing we'll need to do is run npm install. So npm install is the node package manager, and we run this to download a number of third-party open source dependencies. So this will take a few minutes. We'll skip ahead in the video here while this downloads, but this is, again, only a one-time thing. From now on, once we have all these dependencies, we can just run a local build each time without downloading more of these third-party tools. Okay, so that npm install command finished. It did take about 60 seconds more, but we sped up the video. Now that we have all the dependencies, we can run grunt commands to locally build the UI. So to do a build, we will run grunt. We aren't going to specify a task, so it will do the default task, which includes a clean task, then a bower task, and then a build. We will provide the serve flag to tell Grunt to serve the UI after building it, and we will provide an OpenLMIS server URL parameter. This tells the UI what server to use to talk to the backend RESTful APIs. So we're going to specify test.openlmis.org. That is a publicly available server. It always runs the latest version of the OpenLMIS RESTful APIs. That's updated automatically by the build server whenever there are new Git commits. So this is the easiest server URL to use for just UI development. Without this flag, the UI would try to reach some RESTful APIs locally on our local machine. We aren't running them now. We could run them, but that would take extra time and memory. We might need to if we're doing some development of the RESTful APIs, but on the other hand, we should do our backend development first, have those pull requests approved, and then do our UI development separately. So in any case, if you ever have questions about the options and the workflow, those things are documented in the dev UI documentation and the contribution guide. So let's actually run this grunt command to do our first build. As I mentioned, the default grunt tasks start with a clean, then here downloading bower dependencies before it starts the build. The build step will minify the JavaScript, build the CSS, build the HTML, and run tests in Phantom.js. It also builds JavaScript documentation and builds a UI style guide. So this last step after that then will be to start up a local web server where you can view all of this in your browser. So here we are. So far the build steps above there, JavaScript, CSS, HTML all have completed, and now we're running the unit tests. The unit tests will just take a few more seconds to complete, and then it will go on with that documentation and style guide and starting up a local web browser. Okay, success. So the tests, the style guide, the docs, everything built, and now it is running a local UI where we can open our browser and view it. So we will pop into our Firefox browser here and simply go to localhost port 9000. And here we have a few different items. The web app folder is the folder that contains the app itself. But before we go there, I'll just mention the others. Docs has the built documentation. Messages has translation strings. The style guide has the built style guide. Test has the results of the tests that ran. And web app. This is where the UI web app itself lives. So we'll click there, and here it is. Normally, you would need to start out at the login screen and enter a username and password. To find out what those are in the sample data that's running on this test server we're talking to, check out the documentation in the OpenLMIS auth service inside the demo data folder. All of the demo accounts are documented there. Or if you've never been into OpenLMIS before and want a tour of how it works, look at the OpenLMIS YouTube channel. There's lots of videos of how the software works. Log in as different basic users and see the workflows. Okay, so at this point, we have the UI checked out, building and running locally. And now we're ready to start coding. So let's add our new screen. We will step through how to add a new screen into the UI. We'll make a simple Hello World screen. We'll illustrate the structure and basic concepts for developing in the UI. Currently, the UI uses AngularJS 1, and so you'll see it uses Angular patterns in a very modular way. So I will stop that last build that was running, and we'll work on adding our new screen. So first, we create a source folder. The reference UI is actually the only UI repository that doesn't already have one. The other repos already have one. And then we'll create a folder for our component, and we'll name it the OpenLMIS Hello World component. Great. So in this folder, we're going to need 3 files to make our new screen. A .module.js file, a routes.js file, and an HTML file. So for those 2 files that are JavaScript code, we will actually start with the license header that's required at the top of all of our JavaScript files. So first we'll make this OpenLMIS hello world.module.js, and we'll do the same with an OpenLMIS hello world.routes.js. And then we'll also create an empty OpenLMIS hello world.html file. So in addition to these 3 files, there are others we could add, like for unit tests or translated strings. You could browse the UI code repositories to see some other examples, but these are the 3 that are required for this Hello World example. To edit these 3 files, we don't need to work here inside the container at this prompt. I'm going to choose to use the Atom editor. You, as I mentioned, could use the editor or IDE of your choice. So first, we're going to look at the module.js file, but let's open a new window so that we can actually use the editor here on our host computer, on our Linux machine, not inside the container. Great. And I think we'll open the Atom editor to the whole source folder. Okay, so here in the source folder, we see the structure we've created. We'll work first on the module file, then the routes file, and the hello world. So in the module.js file, we're going to grab some starter code from another commonly used OpenLMIS component, which is called OpenLMIS modal, which happens to live in the UI components repository. So let's go find UI components and grab some code. Okay, the UI components repo holds a lot of reusable components that are used throughout the UI. The OpenLMIS modal is the one that we're going to grab some sample code from for this example. The modal has a lot of different files that do different things, but we will just grab its module file for a basic example of what code needs to live there. Again, it starts with the required license header, which we already put into our example, and here's the basic JavaScript code. So in our editor, we will paste in that code and update it to match the Hello World screen that we're building. Okay, So we'll name this module consistently with hyphens or dashes hello.world, and we actually don't need any of these dependencies other than UI router, because we're going to make a screen that can be routed to with a URL, and OpenLMIS config. But other than that, we removed those other dependencies that we don't need. This is all we need for Hello World. Now, saving our changes. Okay, we just got a permissions error. And sometimes developing in Docker, permissions are things to watch out for. We're working on these files from our host machine, from my local workstation here. So I'm going to jump back into my terminal where I can change the ownership of these files to make sure that locally, my local user is actually the one working on them. Okay, so we'll use just the chown or change owner command. And now from our editor, when we save our module file, it's able to save our changes to disk. Great. Okay, second, the routes.js file. Again, we started it off with the required license header. For this file, we'll grab some starter code from the forgot password component, which is in the OpenLMIS auth UI repository. So here's the auth UI. These are components specific to the auth service, and it has a forgot password component. And so we will look at the routes file to see an example of code that's used on a page that you can route to from any other place with a URL. So again, we'll copy that code, paste it in here. Now, we can certainly, starting at the top here, update the module name. This is actually the Hello World module. And we are going to configure some routes for it. So it does have a state provider, so we'll leave that code. But we can update a couple other things. For one thing, we don't need this onEnter method, which is the whole bottom half of the code. So we're just going to remove that. Okay, cleaner already, and we'll remove this reference to it. What we do need is to update the declaration of this state and give it a state name. So we'll call this state OpenLMIS.Hello World and use this convention of inner capitalization here. We also can define what URL this goes to, and so we'll just use the URL /Hello World, again following that convention. We didn't need the onEnter piece at all, but there's one other important thing that this particular component has, which is a template. So we'll set a template URL, and it is OpenLMIS Hello World / the HTML, which is OpenLMIS Hello World.html. Okay, that's it. That's all we need here in this routes.js file. So this file defines the routes, the URLs we can use to get to this new page. So lastly, the page itself is in the HTML file. We don't need any starter code here. It starts out empty. HTML files don't need the license header, only JavaScript. So we'll just put in our hello world message in one simple div, some simple markup. Okay, we'll save that as well. And at this point, we've done it. We've created our new screen. It has this component folder with these 3 simple files required to define the component. We gave it a URL route, and we gave it some basic HTML markup. Okay, our previous build is still running. No, okay, we're at a command prompt. There isn't a build running right now, so we'll need to run a fresh build that'll find these new files and build them into the system. So we'll go back and run our last grunt command again to run all those, but we don't need actually quite as many steps. We can just run a grunt build task, but still we want to serve it and hit the test.openlmis.org services. So this will not do the Bower dependencies steps again, it'll just do the build steps that we need. There's also a grunt watch task that we could use to have grunt watch for any code changes and automatically rebuild as soon as it finds them. Okay, the build finished. So now we can go to our browser and try to see our changes. So we're gonna shift reload actually twice to make sure the whole app gets totally reloaded here. And now this is just the home screen of OpenLMIS, but with the URL we defined, which is hello world, we can try to navigate to our new screen, and it worked. Okay, we did it. So to summarize the steps, we created a new folder, we added those 3 files to define our component, we rebuilt the code and ran it locally to see our change. That's all that's needed for this Hello World example, but we do have some bonus information here next about how we could add this new screen into the navigation menu. Okay, so as a bonus, let's put it in the navigation menu. So the first step in doing that is to update our routes.js file and add just a bit of information that we want to show this page in the navigation. So we'll set show in navigation true, and we also need to provide a label. Now, before we fill in the label here, it's important to say every string in OpenLMIS must be translatable for users in different languages. So we will create a translation file that will use a key and provide the string in a particular language. And to do this, we will create a messages underscore en.json file, which will define English messages. And it's a simple JSON file where we can use keys and values. So the key we'll make matches the name of our component. We'll call it the Hello World title, and the title that will appear on the menu bar will just be hello. So we need to give this file a name, and we'll call it messages.en.json. Great, okay, that's our new file. So now in the label value, we can actually fill in the key OpenLMIS hello world dot title and save our changes. Now let's go back and run our build once more to pick up that new file. We'll need to run the build command again. It wouldn't be enough to just do a grunt watch, wouldn't find new files. Okay, so the build just completed with our new file included. Let's go see our changes in the browser. So again, we'll reload twice and make sure the browser has totally reloaded and restarted this app. And there it is. We actually see that this Hello World URL actually now takes us to the new page that we created, and the breadcrumbs are automatically set up for us. And this is using that string hello that we put in the English translation file. So that's it. We've now added our screen to the menu in a way that can be translated. Okay, so in this video we have seen from scratch how to start with the prerequisites, check out a Git repository, add a new Hello World screen, locally build and run the OpenLMIS UI with our changes, and that is the basics of developing in the OpenLMIS UI. In the description below this video on YouTube, we'll put links to the documentation and repositories so it's easy to follow along, and also to the reference UI documentation, the dev UI documentation, and the UI style guide that are the best starting places. To try out this Hello World example on your own, feel free to rewind and pause the video. Try this yourself to make sure you're comfortable with all the steps. And we invite you to get involved with the OpenLMIS developer community. See the Getting Started section of the website. Getting Started for Developers actually has information on how to join our Slack channel and get connected with the community. So thanks for watching the video, and thanks for your interest in OpenLMIS.